My dissertation topic is on the conservative movement here in America, political institutions, and China and Taiwan policy. And it's a really good exploration of how the conservative movement has evolved since World War II. I'm really interested in this larger question of, does ideology play as much of a role in shaping the conservative movement and China and Taiwan policy, or is it more on institutions? And what sort of institutional factors are driving this? I do believe that the Chinese are actively trying to not only spy on Americans, but to try and turn Americans and other individuals across the world to work for the Chinese state.
Let's let China do the manufacturing and we'll do all the IP and we'll be the head and they'll be the body. And I just think that we didn't expect that China would develop the manufacturing and then go right in and start stealing the IP to take the whole game.
They thought that China was going to play by the rules.
Welcome to 775 Alive,
a podcast focused on Nevada.
From Vegas to Reno to Elko.
We decode politics, economics, and critical global issues.
Offering common sense perspectives true to our Nevada roots.
I'm Scott Gaworski, PhD historian.
And I'm Crystal Newton, business strategist.
Let's get into it. Well, welcome back here to 775 Alive. Crystal and I are joined today by Sherman Tylawsky. Thank you for joining us, Sherman.
Hello, Scott. Hello, Crystal. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
And of course, Sherman just here recently ran for that as the youngest candidate in that CD2 race up here in Northern Nevada just through the last primary season. Has done some interesting stuff with political activism. You're a co-host of the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast, which we'll talk about a little bit, director of the George Washington Institute. And as we found out last week, Sherman and I are ended up sitting together on a Nevada Forum working group, looking at some policy proposals for the next legislative session. So a lot of stuff to talk about here.
Yeah, he's amazing. He's got such a big portfolio that I almost forgot that he ran for a CD2. I'm super focused on his U.S.-China background and his knowledge on that. We rarely get to talk to anyone about this. And China's kind of the big elephant in the global room, isn't it?
I just want to first say, again, thank you for having me to talk about all kinds of issues. I imagine we'll be talking about, of course, U.S.-China, about the campaign, and other things in between. But I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation. I will want to add to that, so hopefully not too long of a list of things I've got to do, but I'm also a doctoral candidate for the political science PhD program at the University of Alabama, and I'm currently writing my dissertation, and so that's my main job, shall we say, and the other things are going to be coming into place pretty well, and other things coming down the line too. So just want to add that.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting. I'm assuming the dissertation doesn't have much to do with China.
Actually, it does. It actually does. Yes.
Cool.
so I mean, we can start with that, and we work our way in a direction that you want to go to. But I want to first say that my mother is an immigrant from Taiwan, and that obviously is a big part of my life. I'm originally from the San Francisco Bay Area, but my parents actually got married in Carson, right here, 30 years ago, over 30 years ago. And they bought land down in Smith Valley. We're going to live here. But my mom got a job in California, and my dad, who is originally from New York, but is of Ukrainian descent, or present-day Ukraine, I should say. And he is a sailor. So he was on ships for about 35 years. And he needed to be close to the ocean. And it's a bit of a drive from here to the San Francisco Bay Area. So my parents raised me over there. And I grew up in San Francisco, a little bit in Santa Rosa as well, up north. But I've always had an interest in not just international relations, but really where the United States is in the larger world, and where we stand ideologically, where we stand geopolitically. I remember getting one of those newspaper subscriptions when I was in high school and reading about news about everything from New York City to what's happening in DC or what's happening in Montana, shall we say. For the topic, it's really a combination of a lot of things that I've been able to do, and I'll be able to learn, really, because with every pursuit of knowledge and of scholarship, it's never just yourself. It's about the people who brought you along in the journey. But my dissertation topic is on the conservative movement here in America, political institutions, and China and Taiwan policy. And it's a really good exploration of how the conservative movement has evolved since World War II. It's a really fascinating history, and I don't think we would be in the state of politics now without a nod toward history and how the conservative movement for different reasons has become what it is. And I'm looking at through mainly in the institutional route. So if you think Congress, the media, the presidency, and I'm really interested in this larger question of, does ideology play as much of a role in shaping the conservative movement and China and Taiwan policy, or is it more on institutions? And what sort of institutional factors are driving this? And my theory is that ideology used to be a very big deal, particularly with the Cold War context. You think the fight against communism. But I think after the Cold War ended in 91 formally, I think there's been a bit of a change in how our politics are shaped. And I'm really theorizing that institutions are really shaping how the conservative movement has gone by. And of course, that has implications, right, on the liberal movement. I think there's a very interesting element on that aspect. But that's really the big picture, is really saying, is ideology or our institutions defining how we're going in our politics today?
Well, and that's sort of interesting because, institutions are fairly a broad term. And one of the things we're dealing with is sort of a set of institutions that, 25, 30 years ago, we weren't really think about it. And one of the big ones that gets under Crystal's skin all the time is sort of the Chinese spy industry, right? And using those, the honey trap like we saw with Eric Swalwell.
That's right. And I think you brought up a really good point, Scott, because I find that with countries that have authoritarian regimes, and they're always trying to, of course, undermine other countries, what they try to do is their main goal is to divide, right? It's kind of like a divide and conquer strategy. I know that there's people who might think that the Chinese are trying to achieve a certain kind of electoral result, let's just say, like potentially to support one candidate or another. And that might be the case. I think, though, a larger driving force is the divide element, because in China, everything is about collectivism, right? It's about the state, and everything's got to protect the state. State, everything is under the state. And so when you have that unitary system and it's countering this pluralistic democratic system, you're going to see obviously very different ways of not just survival, but of dominance, right? And trying to export your system to other parts of the world. So I think on the Chinese spy element, just big picture, I do believe that the Chinese are actively trying to not only spy on Americans, but to try and turn Americans and other individuals across the world to work for the Chinese state. And so that could be in the form of Confucius Institutes, which is kind of ironic because one of the things that the Chinese Communist Party has done is try to change history and to destroy history and destroy the values that Confucius, the great thinker, had. And so it's really kind of sick in a way to see the authoritarian state like that you weaponize a name like Confucius. But it's part of a larger network of whether it's trying to get favorable deals with American companies, whether it's stealing technology, particularly as we have Silicon Valley not too far down I-80, and there's no question that given that they're particularly, and I hate to go into the demographic part, but given that there's a lot of Americans of Asian descent there's no question that they're trying to potentially exploit that sense of identity and try to get people to turn against a lot of the foundations of what we stand for. So there's a lot of different complexities with this, but I think the main thing is I do think China sees this as an ideological battle and sees that the United States can provide that state with the economic benefits and all that, but I don't think it really sees America the same way as, say, the founders intended in terms of when they designed our government.
So, Sherman, you're describing a lot of things that I think they fall on a spectrum of they go from this is self-preservation of a nation and trying to do the best thing for your people to being almost toxic in the world, in that you're taking at all consequence and it really doesn't matter what the outcomes are, and it becomes a little bit of a toxic thing in the global community. How do you, obviously China has a right to defend itself and try to make the best deal for its people. And you've studied this really deeply. And I wonder what your 30,000 foot view on this is. Is this China just trying to make the best deal for their people? Or is this more of a deliberate plan to position themselves as a global leader?
Well, I would say one thing, which is I believe there's a fundamental difference between the Chinese government and the Chinese people. Because I don't believe that the Chinese government is legitimately elected. They don't have competitive elections. They didn't it's not like when we talk about elections here in Nevada that we have primaries and then, people go to town halls and there's a real clash on ideas, or we have debates on Fox News or CNN. They don't have any of those things there. It's all from the same rotten tree, and so I think I want to make that distinction clear, which is it's unfortunate that in a place like China, where there's so much history and there's so much culture there, that, like I said earlier, that history is being erased, and certainly even recent history like Tiananmen. We all know what happened in Tiananmen, but the Chinese government can't let that narrative spread across that country. So there's a lot at stake here, really, when you have a people that really didn't have much of a choice. Now, some of the older generations, I'm sure, recall those times in the early days of Mao and all, because Mao dies in 1976. But you still have a generation that has witnessed a number of things, and notably COVID. And there's certainly, I think, always a case to say that a state has the right to defend itself. However, when you have this large gap between the state and the people in terms of legitimacy, I think that's where I'd say that the interests of the state are not resonating with what was really good for the people.
Can we expand on that a bit? Because I think there's an interesting connection on that ideology side with this, because one of the sort of Western stereotypes that goes back to the 1970s, 1980s about China is that the Chinese really are Chinese first and communist second. That despite for all the rhetoric, they're playing sort of a different game. And this is, for instance, what allows talking about the conservative movement. And I'm not sure if you're dating one of the shifts, but of course, only Nixon can go to China, right? It requires the ultimate Cold Warrior to open up the door to China as a counterweight to the Soviet Union. But there's also what happens in the late 70s, where China gets involved in a war with Vietnam, which is just 5 years removed from the collapse of South Vietnam, unified communist country. And this sends huge shockwaves, particularly through the political and academic left in the West. Because one of their theories is, of course, communist countries don't go to war against each other, right? And this is what leads to Benedict Anderson's imagined communities and sort of all that strand of thought, where these disillusioned leftists now have to deal with a China that seems to be operating very much like what they consider a right-wing nationalist. Do you think China is actually forging a separate ideology from traditional communism that we saw during the Cold War? Or is, now we're seeing an effort to sort of revitalize that sort of memory of Mao, right? And Chao Enlai and these others?
That's a great question, Scott. I'll start with a quote. I'll say in Mandarin, I'll translate, which is 一山难容二虎, which means you cannot have two tigers on the same mountain. And I think that says a lot about where the Chinese stand on their position. Not to mention that their own name is 中国. If you look at the character of Zhong, it actually is basically like a rectangular box, and there's a vertical line that goes through it. And so it means central. And then Guo is kingdom. So they see themselves as the central kingdom, literally. So I think that the Chinese are in some ways clever in terms of their culture, because I don't think they try to hide it. I think we in the West might try and think oh, they're probably trying to play a game or something. I actually think they're pretty direct. It's just the way that I think we've interpreted the Chinese government, how they do things. We think that they're just going to be siding eventually with some element of democracy, right, or some element of economic liberalism, and I don't find that's the case. I find that the Chinese certainly can operate on two sides, where they can say the right things in public, but genuinely, I don't think they see the United States as a good model for how to rule over a people. And I say rule over because I don't think they're governing. I think they're ruling over the Chinese population. And so on the ideology part, and that's really interesting, Scott, because especially with each of these Chinese leaders, because you have Deng Xiaoping, right, who is trying to modernize China in the 80s and trying to get it to a different spot in terms of trying to become more advanced. I think Xi Jinping is a really interesting case. I'm not an expert on Xi Jinping or about the Chinese leaders, but what I can say, it does seem like the issue of Taiwan is always that unattainable goal of every Chinese leader since 49, when the Chinese Civil War ends, when you have the Kuomintang go across to Taiwan to establish that country there. Now, there's always been a government there in some form, but there's always been the struggle of a Chinese leader to make that impression, make that legacy in the form of the Chinese Communist Party. And of course, I don't think having the term communist in the name is a surprise, because I do believe that that's from the very beginnings back in the 20s when the party was founded. I think they've always operated on this element of Marxism, Leninism. And I think that with Xi Jinping, and really with any subsequent leader, there's always going to be the question of how does that Chinese leader, who probably sees himself as an emperor more than a president, how does that leader make his name for the party, right? And how does he try and advance the party to a different level? And I imagine that Taiwan is constantly in Xi Jinping's mind and every Chinese leader's mind as that moment where they can kind of reclaim what the CCP stands for in that sense.
I want to talk about Taiwan, but I think first I want to juxtapose the U.S. and China, where on one hand you have the U.S. that has built a system that legally believes in its individual citizen to take responsibility for their life, to determine where they're going to go and what they're going to do. Whereas China just makes the assumption that people can't make the best decision for themselves, and they'll go ahead and make that for them. Now, what's interesting to me is, how does Taiwan feel about all this? And more importantly, how did a Taiwan emerge out of that Chinese ideology with a freedom and democratic ideology? How did that happen?
Well, I will say that one of the interesting things about some of Taiwan's leaders, particularly Sun Yat-sen. So Sun Yat-sen is one of the early leaders of Taiwan. He was actually inspired by the U.S. and by George Washington and about American values, because my understanding is that he went through some schooling under the U.S. system. So that I think is interesting. I'm not an expert on Sun Yat-sen himself, but I remember learning about that. I believe there's a couple things, and relating to the dissertation topic, it's a really fascinating history, because we often think that the contemporary U.S.-Taiwan relationship starts in 1979, because that's when the Taiwan Relations Act is established, and that formally recognizes that the U.S. and Taiwan do not have formal diplomatic relations. The U.S. is going to have formal relations with China, and so but there is that contingent, right, of strategic ambiguity where the U.S. would defend Taiwan from any sort of attack on it. But the relationship really solidifies after World War II, because the conservatives are looking for this opening. This part of it is politics, because of course everything is politics nowadays. But Truman and the Democrats are running the show on foreign policy, on the Marshall Plan, right? They're trying to contain communism. That is the name of the game. But the conservatives are struggling to find that opening. And what they find is they find Asia is that opening where they criticize the Truman administration for kind of, if you think about it, like a leaky bucket, right? They're kind of saying you're addressing this hole of trying to prevent communism from spreading, but you're not doing that in Asia. And so for initially, it started off as just simply an opening for conservatives who have an interest in foreign policy and have some internationalist leanings. And that solidifies as part of the movement because you're having a Senate Majority Leader, and his name was William Nolan. There we go, Senator Nolan from California, of all places. He is one of the big champions of supporting Taiwan and keeping China out of the United Nations. And so this really starts to solidify as part of the official relationship before '79, before the 70s. And then even after, even though the U.S. does not have formal relations with Taiwan, you still have this pipeline of relationships and of trips to Taiwan from members of Congress that has long been established for all these decades. And I think it's that element there where Taiwan did undergo some really, really crazy things happening. Martial law really occurred until the 80s. That's my recollections. And to go from that, part of it was the economic side of things. The economy started to modernize. The U.S. certainly, of course, supporting Taiwan militarily speaking. But to see this rapid transformation for Taiwan to holding a democratic election in 1996 for president, this, I think, is a culmination of, I would say, the United States having that effect, but also the fact that it's probably some of the founding there within Taiwan to know that there is that common heritage of Chinese heritage, but it is a different place. It is a different system, and it does not subscribe to what the Chinese Communist Party imposes on its people.
Just a quick question, follow-up, Sherman. My guess, and I know nothing about this subject, is there was some American investment in Taiwan that helped tip them over the edge. Is that right?
That's my recollection. Yeah. So there's been a lot. I mean, there's the American Institute in Taiwan, which is kind of our unofficial embassy there. But there's also a U.S. Taiwan Business Council. So I just to say, for just going back to institutions, there's also the institutions that are supporting those efforts there. So the investments in Taiwan and, of course, Taiwan investments here in the U.S.
I just want to give credit to my business people because we can really tip the scale when it comes to these things.
Well, and this brings up something that's sort of interesting because you already mentioned, ironically, people tend to forget that the U.S. almost has a special relationship with China that goes back to the beginning of the Republic under the United States. I mean, American foreign exports are curtailed after the revolution because they no longer have access to French ports and English ports and all this other stuff. And very quickly, we see New England merchants engaging in the China trade. So by the 1820s and 1830s, even though China is very much isolated, American hulls are carrying a lot of the goods coming back out of China. Of course, by the time we get to the 1880s, 1890s, it's the United States that's propounding the open door policy in China, that they're not going to let China be colonized by the European powers, right? For some definitions of colonialism. But then talk about Sun Yat-sen. I mean, Lady Chiang Kai-shek. Lady Kai-shek is actually educated at Harvard. It has very close relationships with the political elite in the United States in the 30s. This is one of the reasons they're so supported against Japan. But that 49 issue is illustrative because I think there's an interesting parallel. Crystal brought up business, which is part of it. But one of the things that happens is when the communists conquered China in 49, the repercussions isn't just against the Truman administration for not being strong enough against the communists, but it really sparks a huge backlash against the CIA and the State Department that doesn't see this coming, right? And this feeds directly into the Red Scare that there's communists in the State Department. It shades over into the Lavender Scare where they're looking for homosexuals in the State Department and the CIA, and under the justification they're falling victims to Chinese spy rackets. But even today, I think conservatives have a tendency that when something seems to be going wrong with China policy, a lot of their targeting seems to be geared towards American institutions. I mean, one could argue even Trump's argument about data centers and chip manufacturing is an example of this. China's getting an upper hand, and it's because we haven't done enough, right? We've engaged in globalization, so we need to do more here against it. Is that factoring into some of this? Because I think there's an interesting point where China almost serves as sort of not a boogeyman, but an example of where leftist political thought always seems to fail in the U.S.
Scott, that's a great point. And because you're talking about the timing there, at that time, conservatives lamented that in 1949 as a loss of China. And in the sense that they were hoping that the Kuomintang were going to prevail, and unfortunately they didn't. And so I would imagine that history can tell a lot of conservatives saying that it does feel like that the U.S.-China relationship is very much a game of opportunities, in the sense that when there was that opportunity to be able to challenge China on human rights issues, for example, after Tiananmen, but that certain economic interests came about. You probably have some conservatives probably looking back and say, "Man, that was a mistake. We could have really maybe made efforts on the human rights element, but we lost opportunities there." On the flip side, you might also have people who are concerned, or certain conservatives. And I would say, when I say certain conservatives, I do mean that like the pro-business side of conservatives. So they favor less the economic interventionism. They want more trade with China and all. They might say that the sanctions on Hong Kong, for example, might be those are lost opportunities. So and that I think feeds into the larger element where I think with Nixon, Nixon saw an opening with public opinion, because public opinion was trending that way anyway, and during the 50s and the 60s. And it's Nixon that finally pulls the trigger and says, this is our opportunity, opportunity to finally reopen relations with China. And same thing with I think with regards to China's entry in the WTO, where certain wings of the conservative movement are probably thinking this is finally our opportunity to capitalize on China finally entering into the 21st century economic system. So there's a lot, I think, where based on that history of the loss of China, I think this sense that conservatives might be losing that game, or they might be losing opportunities to reshape the course of U.S.-China relations. I'd say that is at least one consideration that every president, conservative or liberal, has considered on the Chinese relationship, in part because with such a complex relationship and the fact that there's now so many consequences to how that relationship works or doesn't work, there's clearly a lot of interest in the presidents and members of Congress to figure out, okay, what is the name of the game here? What is our strategy to potentially alter how geopolitics and the global economy work?
Do you have a question there, Crystal?
Yeah, there's a lot to consider there. And I was trying to think of a simplistic way to describe what's happening between the United States and China. Maybe you can help mold the way I think about this, Sherman. It seems to me that the American culture teaches people to be your best self, and that's how you get ahead, and that's how you get the best products. And China's stance, more of that collective communist socialistic type view, is all you need to do is stay ahead of the best person. And so their view in life is look around the world, see what's working the best, and try to get ahead of it. Now, from the American standpoint, when Nixon opened this up, I mean, I think our thinking was, let's let China do the manufacturing and we'll do all the IP and we'll be the head and they'll be the body. And I just think that we didn't expect that China would develop the manufacturing and then go right in and start stealing the IP to take the whole game. And I think we're kind of trying to figure out how to manage that at this point. Is that an accurate summary?
I'd say much of the, if you want to say establishment, I know it's a a term that can be used in a lot of different ways. So if you want to say that, I think there were a lot of people within the Nixon administration and subsequent administrations that thought exactly that. They thought that China was going to play by the rules. That was what a lot of conservatives and liberals, especially in the 80s and the 90s, even in the 2000s, they said they're going to be finally part of the game, finally as a major player. And so if you're on the conservative side, you might be able to say, okay, now this is an opportunity for them to play by the rules so we can have a good economic competition, right? And to be able to grow our respective economies and make the world a bit richer. And then you have on the liberal side, people saying that, well, of course they're going to be playing by the rules, right? If they play by the rules, we can tackle climate change. We can tackle human rights. We can do all those things. It was, I believe, on a fallacy of assuming that, in some ways, assuming that every country in the world just plays like a rational player in the mind of an American. And what I think we've constantly failed, and this is regardless of whether it's China or Iraq, Afghanistan, or somewhere else, where we do believe that because we're the big dog in the world, that everyone's got to eventually adopt values, kind of in a way where it seems like we kind of fuel our own values with the founding of the country. It's like, oh, if you just get the right values, the right people in there, then you're going to change society. Well, clearly, if you look at the differences between the U.S. and China seized 1776 like it was last week, and so it's that kind of mindset where we have lost that too. We kind of think that we're so established that a player like, or a country like China is definitely going to play by the rules that we write. Well, the Chinese, they've gone through a number of thousands of years of history. They've seen revolutions. They've seen how empires come about and collapse. There clearly was, I believe, a collective misunderstanding of how China operates. And while I'm sure there were some good intentions in that, that I don't think is an excuse for misunderstanding a major player like China. And we're certainly paying the price for that in terms of, as you mentioned, right, with regards to whether it's jobs, whether it's national security. And we still have a lot of work to do on that end of ensuring that people understand this larger relationship and seeing the threat of, again, making that distinction between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people. But I'm hopeful that with more of that effort, that people will be able to see that, you know what, it's not a good thing to just let everyone else manufacture things, because what if you do need to manufacture your own products, and particularly if it's something highly sensitive like computer chips or something. So there's a lot that I think we've gone through over the last few decades. My goal is to just be candid with people and encourage people to read about the relationship, read about just some of the crazy things that have happened in the last several years of China trying to, again, rewrite a narrative, right? Whether it's about COVID or something else, but also just ensuring that people have that open mind to read and understand and see that we've actually done a lot of things to try and counter that as well. And I do think the people and the policies that have made it a bit easier to detect those threats, to be able to counter those threats, and maintain good communications with Taiwan, those things I think should be recognized too.
I think these are really important things to tease out, because when I look at the U.S.-China relations and how we got here, I see parallels with Iran and Russia in that Americans are failing to understand the value system differences between the countries. And I think that's really critical to try to understand, because otherwise we're going to keep bumbling into this. And so one cool compliment for American culture and society is, in order to achieve freedom in a free market, it requires a ton of trust. And so we learn to watch outcomes and trust outcomes, trust each other, because the free market puts enough pressures on you that it pretty much keeps you honest. And so we're just used to trusting. And we really need to be wary of that when we deal with actors like China and Iran and Russia, because they're very well aware of how trustworthy we are and how much we value trust. And they play right along with it. And we go, okay, like China will be like, okay, we'll buy soybeans and we'll buy your Boeing airplanes. And then 6 months, 18 months down the line, why haven't you bought them yet? Well, we're dealing with a little bit of economic issues. We're going to get to it, blah, 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 blah. And then they never get to it. But we did our side of the bargain. So, I mean, we really need to watch this kind of stuff and really understand it.
Can I, before you answer that, because I think you lucked out here, Sherman, because this question between ideology and institutions is playing out here. Right. Crystal just outlined, I think, a very good argument about the ideology, the value-based differences. I would argue that one of the problems the U.S. is facing vis-a-vis China and other countries, but specifically vis-a-vis China as an institutional issue, is that a lot of that theory that comes out of the 50s and 60s and 70s, so-called modernization theory, holds even down to today that China is a developing country, that it needs leeway because it's got institutions, it's got infrastructure to build. Oh, we can't hold China to climate change accords because they need to build their infrastructure. And I think part of what we're missing is they have built that infrastructure, right? It's already in place, and that's what's allowing them to still IP and produce high-end goods, which is not what was being thought in the 80s. U.S. thought China was going to be, another Vietnam, right? Or another South Korea producing sort of low-end, they might be technological items, but they were low-end sort of commercial products, not the high-end manufacturing that China has already demonstrated, but we still insist they're a developing country.
Exactly. If I can combine what you both said in there on the ideology and institutions, my theory is that I do believe ideology still matters, of course. Right? You can't have a lot of things without ideology, without some element of a belief system. My concern, of course, nowadays is whether or not the people we elect, members of Congress, the president, Supreme Court justices are not voted by the people, but of course we have the confirmation process in the Senate. So that includes judges on the local level, state level. My concern is that the institutional decay that is happening, whether it be political parties or government, might be in the way of people really understanding these issues. So, for example, one of the things I'm looking at, of course, is looking at Congress. So I look at how members of Congress have developed these positions on China and Taiwan policy. There's a very big difference between a member of Congress who has studied and understood the issue and can form an opinion about China and Taiwan versus somebody who might be supporting a bill that cracks down on, say, Chinese companies trying to invest in some industry. But that person is voting mainly or purely on party lines. And so what happens if you have a political party that just has a different person there, could be from a more radical wing on the left or on the right, and that person just all of a sudden says, and I would expect this person to say, well, this whole thing of the U.S. cracking down on the CCP, that's stuff, that's, uniparty talk or something. And what if they now adopt a position that is much more friendlier to the CCP? Now those people, if they're part of the leadership in that party, my concern is that because of partisanship and how that has creeped into so much of our politics, that you're not going to be able to incentivize enough members to think of what's best for our national security or for our country, and instead going along party lines. Polarization, I think, is working in a similar direction where there's both as I mentioned, radical policies on the left or on the right, but also just more of the animosity, right? That can really divide institutions. There's a lot there, but I'm certainly concerned that we're not building enough or strong enough of an ideological base to prop up these institutions, so that you don't. It's not like I just want an institution to think one way. It's more about what are the processes that take place. How do members of Congress actively understand these issues? Because there's a gazillion issues out there. We can sort of touch upon those in a little bit, but there's so much there that needs to be done. And I'm curious to see how institutions hold up over the course of time, but it's really a lot of things that we have to do to repair our institutions so that they can better adjust to the ebbs and flows of the U.S.-China relationship.
I think we've done a really good job of talking about the China-U.S. policy on a global stage, kind of what the basics are of that. But of course, we live here in Nevada, and I really want to try to look at how Chinese actions have a direct impact on Nevada. I know that they're involved in lithium dumping, which makes it hard for us to mine lithium at a profitable rate. They use that rare earth card all the time, and we have a rare earth mine, I think about an hour south of Las Vegas, technically in California. What else am I missing, Scott? What else are there? Data centers?
Oh, data centers is a big one.
It's a big part of it.
Yeah.
So how do you see Chinese relations directly impacting Nevada, Sherman?
Absolutely. I think this is there'll be a good transition into talking about the campaign and all, just hearing from a lot of different voters about this. I'll say two things about it. The first is that China sees not just the larger geopolitical battle, they see technology as a means to achieve that. There's clearly a lot of value to everything from data to efficiency, energy, things like that. And I think the Chinese really do see that as a big component of how to execute their worldview. And they're already doing that really to keep their state right now with the censorship that happens, with the social credit system where basically if you do something wrong, you get these points that are deducted so you can't buy a train ticket or buy or borrow money, things like that, which is crazy to think, insane, bonkers to imagine here in the States.
No, I just want to say, just to illustrate what you just said, it's like you were speeding, you got pulled over, you got a speeding ticket. Now, instead of a 2% APR on your credit card, you're going to have to pay 4% because you got bumped into a worse class. Right?
Right. It's things like that. And I imagine that they're not going to be fair over there. I don't think they believe in a meritocracy over in a place like that. But anyway, that's just big picture in terms of technology, how it plays into with China. And of course, they're using all kinds of methods to do that. Where data centers play a role here is, and this is, again, a little big picture here, so not necessarily just on the China issue. One of the things that I've been hearing about is the public opinion about data centers, right? Whether they're using more or less energy, or using more or less water, or whether we want these huge places in our backyards. I'd say, though, that we have to be a bit cautious about how we read public opinion on data centers. And the reason why I say that is because data centers are not just a physical structure with a lot of wires in them. I believe in this day and age, it means uncertainty that people have about the future of AI in work, the future of social media. Certainly, there's no shortage of people's experiences, bad experiences on social media, to say the least. There are concerns about income inequality, perhaps, particularly on the left, when it comes to big companies and the general public. All I'm saying is that there's a lot of different fault lines that might be there that we might not be addressing as well. I'm not saying that data centers in themselves, in terms of the projects themselves, are controversial. I'm just saying that I do think we need to be more cautious of how we understand where people stand on data centers, because there are the arguments, right, of people saying that, well, we are using more data, that we are relying a lot more on our phones, our computers, and this AI technology, which we're still trying to figure out in many ways. There is that aspect, but I do think that there's a larger nexus of different concerns that people have that have culminated in a data center, if that makes sense. And that's the academic side of me in terms of how I read public opinion from my experiences. I just know public opinion is very difficult to measure because of the disparities of what people know or don't know about certain issues. And I just put that as a word of caution to say perhaps someone who's opposed to data centers might be just opposed to the fact that maybe that person's son or daughter is going to be working in accounting and is not sure what AI is going to do to his or her job. Or it could be someone who might be a farmer, right? And is concerned that the data centers can be taking away a lot of the energy or perhaps water resources. So there's sometimes the issues could be very complex, and so I just want to offer that as part of the data centers component. In the larger picture, I hope that data centers can be part of the conversation about the larger geopolitical competition against China, because China certainly is going to be paying attention to this very closely. I imagine that the Chinese Communist Party is going to be seeing how it can have an effect on the discourse about data centers, trying to maybe, again, going back to the divide and conquer element I mentioned earlier. There's a lot to look forward to, but I'm hoping that there's a conversation, there's robust conversations of vision and ways where we can improve not just the conversation about data centers, but conversation about all these issues that are crashing into one pretty large mess here.
Sounds like what you're describing is a new style of politics.
Well, I was going to say a slight alteration of that is like this firmly lands in the political candidate's lap, because we're talking about water resources, we're talking about electricity resources, we're talking about potential infrastructure for military, we're talking about the takeover of the free market, we're talking about the war between China and us and what happens if they get there first. I mean, we're talking about everything that human beings care about, all wrapped up into one issue. So it's pretty important.
It is, yeah.
So it's interesting you bring up, Sherman, this issue of preparing leaders, because, one of the things you and I first met when you're running for the CD2 race here in Nevada, and I've already mentioned you were the youngest candidate out of that slate of 15, I think, right? Morgan Wadsworth, I think, a bit younger than you on the Democratic side. But it's an interesting discussion, because I think one of the things we're caught in the U.S. in right now across the nation, but it's certainly played out here in this most recent election cycle here in Nevada, is this about this old established political assignment, the traditional way you do stuff, and new alternative approaches. Give us a bit here of your experience doing that and where you see this sort of new generation, new style of leadership emerging, if at all, here in Nevada.
Sure. Well, first of all, I ran that campaign for the Republican primary in CD2, and I have to say, I got to meet so many amazing people, including Scott. Scott, as you recall, I went up to Elko for that GOP meeting in the council chambers there, and it really is quite a process where I learned so much. And you really start to see the workings of how this form of democracy occurs, whether it's people putting together the town halls, whether it's local journalists, whether it's interest groups, right, chambers of commerce, you name it. There's a lot of different stakeholders at play. So I just want to first acknowledge just all the people I got to learn from, and not to mention the candidates I got to know. Got to know a number of different candidates, even candidates who are running very, very, very heated races in those primaries, which the heat is understatement. It's August now, so it's
whatever
probably
are you
really
talking
heated.
about, Sherman?
So it was, again, a very interesting experience. And Scott, on the issue of age, I'm glad you bring it up, because as the youngest candidate, I think there's two things. One is, and I'm kind of glad it's like this, I don't feel like I got a free pass from anybody, whether it's the voters, whether it's interest groups asking questions. So there were a couple of opportunities to talk to groups who were looking for doing endorsement interviews. I believe they treated me just like any other candidate. So there is that side where I appreciate the fact that I was treated very similarly in terms with other candidates, in that there wasn't a distinction of, that guy is under 30, so we'll just give him the free questions and all. You'll just ask him what his favorite ice cream flavor is or something. So I'm glad I didn't do that. On the flip side, though, there is always that challenge of how you get young people involved, and I'll defer to socialization, because politics is very much who you're associated with, or who you socialize with. If you grow up in a certain part of the country and you live there for the first 50 years of your life, you're going to have very obviously different people and different political beliefs, depending on whether you're in a very Republican place or a Democrat place. Could be your family, could be your friends. And so the socialization part, I believe, is where it can get very tricky, because generally people like to be alongside people who are within the same age range or group. And so there's that challenge there. I also think that there's oftentimes, and I think it's kind of unfair, because we can only play the cards we're dealt with. And there is the sense, depending on which generation you ask, thinking that you have kind of one side, certain older generations might think that there is kind of a softness to young people in terms of that because society has changed a lot with the new technology and all that. Maybe there's some certain things that young people might not be understanding a lot, which I think there's some fair criticism of that. Then there's kind of the flip side, where you have certain younger people might say that, well, this is kind of our turn, right? And we're kind of on the ups and all. We're the future, things like that. I want to just summarize all that, because I think within that, there is a lot of value to having a broad tent. And I'm not in the camp of thinking that, everyone who's of a different generation just should not be discounted. I recently watched an episode with my dad. He hadn't seen this episode in years. I had never seen it myself. We watched the first episode of All in the Family from 1971. And I was amazed. I don't remember all the details of it, but I was just amazed seeing that, for that show, first of all, it's a significant show in so many ways. I mean, even Nixon quoted in a couple of the episodes. But for me, I was very intrigued by that, because it was very relatable, and to be able to watch that with my dad and to see some parallels, some differences on how people saw it's different issues, whether it be on race or on income or on class. It was, I think, a very interesting window to look back at and reflect on. So I would say on age is only an impediment if we make it so. And it's, I think, incumbent on everybody to do their best to say, I've got my own experiences. Scott, you have your own experiences. Crystal, you have your own experiences. And it's important just to always revert to the issues that affects all of us. And that, I think, hopefully can cut across some of those fault lines there.
That's a great thing to point out. And I'm, from the business side of things, I watch how business people try to capture people. And when I was listening to you talk about that old timey show, what strikes me when I watch those older shows is how calm it makes my dopamine system feel. And it's like, you can tell that over time we've programmed people's dopamine systems to go for the quicker and quicker hit. But you watch those old timey shows and you can almost feel what it was like to have a normal, unadulterated dopamine system. So just an interesting side note.
Well, All in the Family is also interesting, Crystal. One of the things we've talked about is, of course, rural identity. And one of the things All in the Family led to is the so-called rural purge, where CBS and the networks, as the joke went, killed every show that had a tree in it. That they went hard towards these sort of urban comedies right there because of the success of All in the Family. So Hee Haw and Beverly Hillbillies and all these shows disappear off the air within a single season simply because they want a more urban audience. Which gets to part of this, right? Because one of the things I think that's interesting about the CD2 race, and you talked about meeting people from different perspectives. Of course, you're there in Carson City. I've made the argument over years, Carson City isn't really rural. I mean, it's defined under Nevada law as rural because its population is less than 100,000. But if you look at, population density, everything else, it's clearly an urban environment. What did you find interesting here coming out into the rural sections of the 775? Right? This broader thing. What struck you as sort of totally different than what you were expecting to hear?
I'll tell you a little story. We did a volunteer cleanup in Lovelock on a Saturday morning, and we joined some volunteers, and I got to speak to some of the locals, and it was hard to hear about the struggles with some of the basic necessities, whether it be a functioning sewage plant, whether it be just good schools, having teachers paid enough to be able to stay there to teach the kids, whether it's recreational facilities. And there were a lot of things there. I'd say one of the hardest parts was it wasn't that I was struggling to kind of come up with a number of things that people were concerned about. It's really going back to the role of the U.S. representative. We had talked earlier before the recording that I've had the opportunity to intern on the Hill twice, once for a Democrat congressman, Mike Thompson. He represents the wine country area, and Representative Jody Hice, a Republican. He is no longer in Congress, but he was, of course, at the time, and coming from Georgia. I represent College Town plus some rural parts of Georgia. And I learned a lot about the rules, not because I went in there and just said, okay, let's solve the national debt crisis right now, but it was about understanding how to communicate the rule to the public, because I mentioned some of those issues. Right? I do believe that with some of those critical infrastructure issues, whether it be I-80, for example, where we're dealing with interstate commerce, if we're dealing with critical minerals, right? And if you think Thacker Pass or Winnemucca, those are some really critical issues. I think the federal government can have some kind of role. What was hard, but I think it was necessary, was to be candid about telling people what our vision was for CD2, and to highlight that as U.S. representatives, it's important to respect what the local and state officials do, because there's a lot of issues that I wish the federal government could address. But we also live in a federalist system where everyone's got to play their role and be the best at their game. And it was easy to be able to hear all these kinds of issues and to be able to try and put myself into certain people's shoes, because it's extremely hard. I can't imagine what it is like when you see from the rural side looking at Reno and Sparks and realizing that there's a ton more people there than in the rules. But I also do think that it's important to respect the rural identity, in the sense that respecting their sovereignty, in that sense of ensuring that the county commissioners, the sheriffs, all those people can do the best they can within the resource, and be able to have the federal government or state government, depending on the responsibility, to be able to fill in when there's clearly a need, clearly a state or federal need to be able to do so. So it was a combination of things, but it was really eye-opening to travel to different rural parts and to do my very best to tell them that I can hear from the best of my ability, and I want to really tell people to say, in some ways, I think it's a good thing to say, I have a lot to learn and I'm willing to learn. I believe, going back to age, I think one of the benefits of having young people in politics is there's a lot of opportunity to learn and to grow and to develop experience. And that's certainly a department that people like myself need, but that's, I think, a part of the process. And we felt it was important to just tell people, say that if we have the opportunity, we would love to have you and your community be part of that seat at the table in terms of teaching us about what is needed in the rules.
Yeah, the rules are really, in terms of perception from the rest of the country, are really misunderstood. And it's part of our the culture of rurals. And I love Northern Nevada and the rural people there. They've taught me so much. I came from Seattle, and, it was a huge learning curve for me. And I remember those first few times I went into rural communities and having those eye-opening moments of like, this is completely different from everything. And it was surprising to me that it took a couple years for me to really see what was there. And, after spending that time there, it's hard to communicate to the outside world just how special and worth preserving these groups of people are. And if I could move it away from a subjective statement, I feel like our society, we've never grown and transformed as much as we have in the last 100 years. And the more things we change and the quicker we change, the higher the probability that something will go wrong. And to me, rural communities are the original way that we've transacted ourselves for thousands of years. So if the worst happens and we have some massive failure on a global level with AI, with a pandemic, with any number of things, nuclear war, I really think that the federal government should consider investing in rural communities to keeping them the way that they are, making sure they have what they need. Because I think they're a good security. They're hedging our bet in case everything goes wrong. These people know how to do everything, like without any help, without a textbook. So I think they're so important.
If I'll name drop another show that I used to watch as a kid, it's Little House on the Prairie. It's a show that obviously I didn't really understand at the time when I watched it, but given that it took place in the 70s, this was certainly a very volatile time in American politics. It offered people a sense of simplicity. It offered people a sense of comfort, and that there's a value to bringing people back to the simpler days. I do think that the rules play a very important role in that, in reminding us of where our food comes from and where our food supply chains come from, where our natural beauty comes from, where we get to you can drive around and see some beautiful wild horses. And I do think that there is a very important role for rules to play in that sense. And I would also say that, and this is in general for whether it's for urban or for rural, but certainly on the concept of education, I would say education. I'm going to call it education of walking around is my term for that. There is a lot of value to going to a place like Lovelock or Carlin or West Wendover and looking around and seeing what's interesting. It sounds very simplistic, but the campaign really put me in a spot where I've not only did I not have a choice, but it really made me curious about, okay, why is it called this place, right? Why, what kind of industries are there? And I just know that with meeting some of the great people there, including, again, a number of great candidates too, because candidates do have to come from these places and to represent those. But I gain a new appreciation for the rules, and it is difficult to always combine the interests of South Reno and a different part in the rules. That's probably more of a different conversation regarding your representation and all. But I do think that I've certainly learned that whoever is going to take this seat to replace Congressman Amadei, who's retiring, has a lot of different issues to balance, and it is not easy. And I certainly would not criticize someone for just occupying a position. I think it's important to have your own opinions, to be able to criticize on policies, but I've seen at times when people get personal about somebody, and I never accept that. And I hope that whoever is in that position is going to take on a very different Congress than now, but the responsibilities and the issues are still there. And so there's a lot that, again, I've combined with my time in the rules and in other parts of the district, but certainly gaining that new appreciation was a big benefit there.
Well, this is interesting. I think we're going to be talking to you quite a bit here over the next few years, Sherman, as you continue your career. But for right now, if somebody wants to know a little bit more about the George Washington Institute, which you run, or the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast, where can they reach out to you and chat with you a bit?
Absolutely. Well, for the George Washington Institute, that is my speaking platform in general. So that's presentations. That's mainly the podcast, which is called Friends and Fellow Citizens. It is the first 4 words of George Washington's farewell address. And just very briefly, the podcast is about applying those values to politics today, to understand our history, to understand our civics, and to think about civility and fiscal responsibility and faith and other topics there that may apply to our world today. And you can go onto georgewashingtoninstitute.org and just georgewashingtoninstitute.org. I mean, everyone knows how to spell George Washington, but that'll be the main website. And then on that website, we have, of course, there's a red button there to click on our podcast. Podcast is called Friends and Fellow Citizens. You can find that on any podcast app and on YouTube as well.
Well, it's been great. And if you want to get hold of us, of course, go ahead and shoot us an email at info@775alive.com. Sherman, thank you again for being on. And we'll be, of course, you and I will be talking a little bit more on the Nevada Forum over the next week or so, the working group we're in. But until next time, I'm Scott Gaborski.
And I'm Crystal Newton.
We'll see you around the 775.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to 775 Alive.
Nevada Roots, Global Issues.
Subscribe on YouTube or X.
And on most podcast streaming services.
You can email us at info@775alive.com.
Or send us a message via carrier pigeon.